Hi everyone, this is video C. We are going to go over pages 31 through 39 in your Pentathlon booklets, and so this is section 3 titled Pre-World War II Music. Alright, I hope you have your annotation devices, materials, whatever you need out to read along with me. And even though we are going to go over pages 31 through 39, we're actually not going to go over every page. However, you still need to complete the music analysis sheets for those listening examples. This is the music analysis sheet. All you have to do for examples 1, 2, and 3 is explain the context. What came before or after it? What was happening in music or in society during the time this song was released? Characteristics. What characteristics or details are relevant or important? What technical details or musical theory elements, disciplines, or ideas make this unique? Purpose. What was the intended purpose or message of this piece? And finally, the significance. Why is this music example significant to the World War II era or time period? Does it relate to, affect, contribute to, or impact the music, technology, society, culture, religion, politics, or traditions of the World War II era? Explain. Obviously, I ask a lot of questions here, and you're not going to be able to answer all of them. These are just guiding questions. How do you write this information down? Where do you get this information from? If you look at the listening example sections, they give you all of that information. So all of this information here is going to be pertinent to answering the notes section in the music analysis sheet. You have to look before it too, because this section above actually talks about the Gershwin. So let's go over the homework. What is due by next Friday, January 27th? And remember, we're changing our pentathlon time. Now it's always going to end at 4 o'clock p.m., not 4:15. So I hope you guys tell your parents that it ends at 4, all right? All right, so we talked about those two. All right, let's see. Read and highlight pages 31 through 39. We're doing that right now. And like I said, pages 35 and 36 are actually, they were already done in class last Friday, so you don't have to do that. And finally, study the content from pages 31 through 39. This is like completely connected to each other. If you guys do this and watch the video, then you're already checking off these 3 boxes. In the Great War's aftermath. Just in case you guys don't know, the Great War is another term for World War I. Remember, this unit is about World War II, right? And so World War I was called the Great War. Okay, so I'm just going to put that there. It came to an end in 1918 when ceasefire went into effect in Europe. A ceasefire is a complete stop of a war or a conflict. Okay, a complete stop. All right. They did not call it World War I at the time because most people did not dream that another worldwide conflict would erupt 2 decades later. The United States and Canada had suffered few wartime losses, so their economies found it easy to rebound. In fact, a financial boom began in the next decade, which is often called the Roaring Twenties. So even though a lot of other countries were suffering economically because they had just finished a war and many of their buildings were blown up and there were a lot of people who were displaced, America and Canada, for the most part, weren't really affected because the war was happening in a different continent, and in fact America almost benefited from the war because they were in charge of producing supplies and military weapons and uniforms and food to provide for our allies in Europe. So because of that, America, or the United States and Canada, were not affected. In fact, a financial boom began in the next decade, and this is called the Roaring Twenties. Let me give you a little bit of a snippet of what the Roaring Twenties look like. However, this time of glitz and glam and money and just like the party years of America completely crashed down because of something called the stock market crash, right? So that's when we have the Great Depression. So the Wall Street crash of 1929 launched a massive decline in stock values that would continue until 1932, thereby contributing to the Great Depression worldwide. So this caused the Great Depression Okay. Financial recovery took most of the 1930s. So the entire time during the 1930s was very difficult. Let me give you a little picture and some other images from the 1930s to give you some more context. So as you can see, it was a very different time than the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of despair, depression, hunger, strife, unemployment, and difficulty. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into office as president, he had to work really hard during that decade to help our country get back on its feet through different programs and plans. Through the course of these economic and political upheavals are like conflicts, chaos, crazy situations. Both popular and classical music thrived. So oftentimes when people are in times of despair or difficulty, they look towards the arts, they look towards music, they look towards entertainment to lift their spirits up. So it just makes sense that during this time, a lot of interesting music was produced. And even in the 20s, especially in the 20s actually, that was the jazz age during the Roaring 20s, when people had the money to go out to glamorous parties and things like that. That's when popular and classical music also became a really big part of society and part of the entertainment culture. When times were prosperous, which means lots of money, and when times were hard, which means very little money and a difficult economy, people looked to music for entertainment and escape. That's a big one right there. Often music is our escape. Have you guys ever listened to a song on your phone and you're just sitting there in the car and you escape to a different land or a different situation just because of the song, because of the beat, because of the words that the singer is singing or the themes that the singer is singing about, right? So it is a way for someone to escape from where they are now. Thanks to technological advances in radio, audio recording, and film, it became increasingly easy for even very poor people to hear music on a regular basis. Do you guys think that people would easily access music prior to radios? If you're thinking no, you're correct. Before the radio was created, only the affluent or richest people in a society can afford to buy expensive concert tickets and make it to their local opera house or symphony and listen to a music composition or even attend a concert or a musical theater play or something, right? That's like a luxury for people who have the money. But now because of technology and the portability of music, people could listen to music from the comforts of their own home. And so now it was more widespread. And so it wasn't just the rich people who were listening to music, it was everyone. And if more people listen to music, then obviously music becomes a really big part of society, a significant and popular aspect of society, which it definitely was during the World War II days and even prior to it. Let's talk about the radio days. As the musical style of swing grew in popularity, radio also offered live dance bands such as the one led by Benny Goodman in 1909 through 1986. Let's listen to some swing now.
Isn't that terrible?
Terrible.
Do you guys now get why it's called swing? By World War II, radio had gained tremendous power in American culture. 90% of homes in the United States had a radio, and Americans listened to those radios for about 4.5 hours a day. That sounds crazy, right? But not so much, because I know you guys use your phones or watch TV or Netflix or YouTube for more than 4.5 hours a day. Radio station owners were collectively very conservative about what they considered appropriate material for broadcasting. So what we mean by that is it was like rated G pretty much. So there was a lot of censorship in their programming. Censorship is when you stop the flow of information because of some reason or purpose, right? And since they wanted to keep it at like rated G and family friendly, they did censor a lot of stuff. So it wasn't that all music and all lyrics could be broadcast on the radio, okay? So here's my definition of that: to stop the spread, publication, or broadcast of something not deemed appropriate. Because of prohibition, do you guys know what prohibition was? If you don't know what it was actually a time, and this is a true story, when America actually outlawed alcohol. Can you believe that? So, what would people like your parents or adults do at parties? They wouldn't be able to drink wine or beer or anything like that, right? So this was a time when the entire country outlawed, the federal government outlawed alcohol because they believed that alcohol was really dangerous and bad. And there was a lot of, there was like a religious awakening that kind of fueled this movement. But guess what? Do you think people actually followed this rule? No. In fact, there was a lot of alcohol consumed because people were making alcohol in their homes. All right. So they were bootlegging alcohol. The constitutional amendment that banned the sale, production, transportation, and importation of alcohol between 1920 and 1933. No references could be made to alcoholic beverages on air. So even if a song was about an alcoholic beverage, they could not play the song. Suggestive language and mild swear words were also forbidden, and thus many songs had radio lyrics that differed from the versions in printed sheet music or in other performance venues. That's true with music today too. If you listen to gangster rap and you listen to it on the radio, then every time they say a really bad word, they'll probably not have anything there. But then if you listen to the actual song, the explicit version, on like your own copy on iTunes or whatever, then you can hear all of the bad words and swear words being used. So obviously on radio, there's still the sense of censorship. During the war years, all 4 of the existing U.S. networks had agreed to offer the This Is War program simultaneously, so during 1 hour each week, listeners across the nation heard the same radio broadcast no matter what network station they had tuned in. How do you think this would affect people's viewpoints of the war and the information they gain? If you're thinking that it can inform them of information that they wouldn't have gotten, then that's correct. This is a great way to tell people information that they wouldn't have known otherwise, right? And it's a great way to reach as many people as possible in a very effective and efficient way by the radio, by broadcasting it once to like millions of people. However, what would be the negatives of this type of information dissemination? You're only given one perspective, right? So it doesn't matter if you're listening to radio station 89.9 or radio station 91.5 or 103.2. It doesn't matter. You would have to hear the same program. So it's almost like the same perspective and the same idea is being disseminated across the whole country. So there are positives, there are advantages and negatives, disadvantages of this type of broadcast. All right, let's move on. Keep it snappy. The various technological advances in radio, recording, and filmmaking led to greater financial profit, but these technologies had an impact on music making as well. Early records during the first 2 decades of the 20th century used many different playback speeds, but when electrical recording was developed, it was necessary to standardize the RPM. The largest record company in 1925 was Victor Records, and 78 RPM was the speed Victor had been using, so that was the speed selected as the new standard for everyone. So now we have standardization. So since everyone's listening to music and through technology, we need to now have something standard, right? That everybody can use no matter what. And just because this company just so happened to be the biggest and was creating the most records, and just because they had 78 RPM, because of that reason, all the other companies were like, all right, we'll do ours in 78 RPM too. The disc size was typically 10 inches in diameter. Here's an example here. So if you guys remember math, anybody? That's the diameter. 10 inches, giving a playback time of 3 minutes per side. Can you believe that? When you listen to this side of the record, you can only listen to 3 minutes, okay? And then you would have to flip it over to listen to 3 minutes more. Therefore, almost all popular recordings began to be 3 minutes or less. Have you guys ever wondered why songs are like roughly around 3 minutes? This is why. How not interesting, right? Have you guys ever wondered why most of the songs you listen to are roughly around 3 minutes? Well, this is why. Isn't that interesting? Some songs were performed without all their verses, or musicians performed a song faster than usual so as to squeeze it into the time limit, right? Because it's kind of weird to have half of a song on one side and then have the person flip over the disc so they can listen to the rest of the song. Classical music recordings often made use of larger 12-inch 78 RPM discs, allowing them to hold 4 or 5 minutes on each side. A very long piece, such as a Beethoven symphony, would still have to be divided up among several sides of several discs. Sometimes, however, longer works were modified because of the audio's format's time limitations. For instance, on June 10, 1924, for the first recording of Rhapsody in Blue, George Gershwin, 1898 to 1937, gathered in a studio with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, which had premiered his work 4 months earlier. On this later occasion, however, Gershwin made fairly drastic cuts to Rhapsody, reducing the nearly 17-minute original by almost half, at 8 minutes and 59 seconds, so it would fit into the two sides of a classical size 78 disc. It was worth the effort. The recording sold 1 million copies, and the sheet music also enjoyed brisk sales. Here's an example of the shortened performance. The rise of the crooners. With the introduction of electrical recording, it was possible to preserve much finer details of a performance. Capitalizing on this improved fidelity, certain vocalists developed a more sensitive singing style that became known as crooning. Do you guys get that? Because of technology, now all the little details in a person's voice would be recorded, and because of that, vocalists needed to do a little bit more to make their singing style a little bit better. Historian Larry Starr describes this style as a private experience. The singer's silky, gentle, nuanced voice invites you to share the most intimate of confidences. It speaks to you alone. The most famous of the first generation of crooners was Bing Crosby. Songwriters capitalized on this new singing style, including Irving Berlin, 1888 to 1989, who wrote White Christmas for the 1942 film Holiday Inn. Crosby's recording of White Christmas not only became one of the biggest wartime hits, but also remains the best-selling single of all time. Let's listen to Crosby's 1942 recording.
Just like the ones I used to know.
Tin Pan Alley, a place and a style. In the early 20th century, the leading U.S. music publishers were clustered along 28th Street in New York City. They all had pianos in their front offices so that prospective purchasers could try out sheet music before buying it. By the way, this is what sheet music is. A journalist, Monroe Rosenfeld, found the racket from all the neighboring businesses deafening. Look at that, right? Can you believe that? Look at all of these music stores, and they're all playing their own sheet music, and that means imagine like a song coming out of there, and of there, and of there. So it's so chaotic, so much music coming out of all of these stores. He commented that the piano sounded like a bunch of tin pans being clanged together, and thus the alley got its nickname, Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley does not refer to just the street, however. It quickly became the general term for the kind of music that these businesses published. Many were romantic love songs with rich accompanying harmonies thanks to the same improved recording fidelity that had encouraged the rise of crooners. I don't think we discussed fidelity. Fidelity means like truthfulness. Was able to truly capture the real voice of the singer. As the Depression took hold of the nation's economy, such songs were a form of escape. They were so much in despair that they would escape from their difficulties through listening to this music and going off into a different space, a different world. Alongside Tin Pan Alley's flood of love songs, patriotic numbers also flourished. The ever-prolific Irving Berlin wrote the most enduring song, God Bless America. He had composed a melody in 1918 for a show titled Yip Yip Yap Hank, but had pulled it out of the production and set it aside. In 1938, he was alarmed at the dark threat of fascism that he saw during a trip to Europe. Okay, so fascism is when you have one powerful leader who makes all the rules and everyone basically adores and worships that leader. Okay, so basically like Adolf Hitler, right? So this is the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany. He revised the lyrics and gave the song to the singer Kate Smith, 1907 to 1986, for her Armistice Day radio broadcast in November 1938. The United States now recognizes Veterans Day on the same day, November 11th. So now we can kind of see like the connection between patriotism, the Veterans Day thing, Armistice Day, and this song, God Bless America. Smith also performed the song in September 1939 during the Kate Smith Hour, her weekly radio show. She sang it yet again as the closing number of her program during the next 2 weeks, but omitted it the fourth week. A huge outcry from her listeners led her to reinstate it, and for the rest of the war, she closed every show with God Bless America. Let's go ahead and listen to Kate Smith's God Bless America.
God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Now let's discuss the Gershwins. As a teenager, George Gershwin had attended an aunt's wedding and was thrilled by the music of Jerome Kern, 1885 to 1945, that the dance orchestra had played. He wanted to learn to write music like Kern, so his first step was to work for a Tin Pan Alley publisher, allowing Gershwin to become very familiar with the latest tunes. Gradually, he was given more and more opportunities to write for Broadway, collaborating with various lyricists along the way. The popularity of Al Jolson's 1920 recording of Swanee was a huge boost to Gershwin's reputation, as was the triumphant debut of Rhapsody in Blue. One of the most successful of 1930 productions was the Gershwin collaboration Girl Crazy, so this is a musical. The show's premise was about as thin as a plot could be. Danny, a New Yorker, is exiled by his wealthy family to the all-male town of Custerville, Arizona, in order to cure him of his girl craziness. He foils his family's plans by taking an entire Broadway chorus line of dancers to join him, and he establishes a casino, complete with jazzy entertainment on the family ranch, but eventually he falls for the local postmistress and straightens up his act. Despite the silly storyline, the show was packed with great tunes and strong performers. The Pit Ensemble, an ensemble is a group of musicians or group of people doing some performance together. The pit ensemble, so when we say pit, it's because in a musical or in a show, you usually have like a literal pit in the stage, like right in front of the stage. The ground goes in like into a ditch, and in that section, we have the ensemble, which is a group of musicians who sit there and they basically play live music for the whole show. The pit ensemble for Girl Crazy, the Red Nichols Jazz Orchestra, also featured a phenomenal assortment of players, including Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Gene Krupa, Jack Teagarden, and Jimmy Dorsey. These are all really famous jazz musicians, by the way. Their talents were evident throughout the musical comedy, but especially so in I Got Rhythm, which is a listening example number 1, in which Gershwin blended both jazz and Broadway's Tin Pan Alley elements. However, the singer of that song, Ethel Merman, was a Broadway novice. She skyrocketed to fame thanks to Girl Crazy, where she first demonstrated her ability to project her voice without amplification to the very back row of the theater. We are not going to talk about the next page because we already discussed the song in detail. We already listened to it. We're not going to talk about listening example 2, which is Old Man River, because we already discussed that as well. And we are also not going to listen to example 3 here. So we're just going to skip right ahead and go to page 37 with All Jazzed Up, right? All jazzed up. Jazz resembles classical music in many ways. It is a broad term that encompasses a great many substyles, and jazz often requires considerable musical knowledge to be fully appreciated. Jazz is one of America's most celebrated contributions to the world of music, because jazz came from America, and was a style that truly thrived thanks to advances in recording and broadcast technology. Jazz, like virtually all the popular styles of music in the early 20th century, is the product of blended techniques of music making. The earliest hub of jazz activity was centered in the city of New Orleans, or New Orleans. I don't know how to say it. People say it like New Orleans or New Orleans. But anyways, you guys know that New Orleans was is in Louisiana, and a lot of you guys may have heard of it because of things like beignets or jazz or Hurricane Katrina, right? So I'm pretty sure, or even Mardi Gras. Here are some images. I think it's ringing a bell to you guys. But this is kind of the birthplace of jazz. The city hosted a particularly concentrated red light district called Storyville. Right? So I'm going to circle jazz. I'm going to circle New Orleans. I'm going to circle Storyville, where nearly all the city's bars were situated. Soldiers stationed in the area were frequent patrons of Storyville, where they enjoyed two types of performance, solo piano and combo, using instrumentation borrowed from marching bands. These performers were in competition with each other, which spurred them onward to be more and more inventive. The music in this part of New Orleans was intended to please the customers, and this meant that it was inevitably quick and lively. Piano players incorporated swing rhythms and improvisation and would also imitate the ambiguous blue notes heard in country and classical blues by playing the raised and lowered versions of a pitch simultaneously. Combos did the same, but multiple instruments meant that even more effects were possible. They employed call and response techniques, or they let players improvise simultaneously to create heterophony. So improvisation, right, or call and response. One player plays his instrument, somebody else responds back by playing his instrument. Or you have improvisation, where you don't play off of sheet music, you just play like based on how you feel, without any rehearsal. The layered effect of this collective improvisation resembled the terraced percussion of both Latin American and African traditions. It is clear that this new music drew from many sources for inspiration. Here's a 1908 postcard showing the railroad lines on Basin Street that carried visitors into Storyville, New Orleans. And so this is kind of like where the music happened, where it was born. The earliest performers of this new style were all African American, and they were largely self-taught musicians with little or no formal training. White musicians knew a good thing when they heard it, however, and the style was quickly imitated. Since white musicians often had more training in how to read music, their performances sometimes incorporated less improvisation and more pre-planning. Heading north. In 1917, when the U.S. entered World War I, the Secretary of War, and remember, this is still the Great War. We haven't talked about the World War II time yet, okay? The Secretary of War demanded Storyville's closure so soldiers could focus on their duties. He was like, I don't want my soldiers to go to these bars and listen to people playing piano. I want them to train in the military and be focused on only training, and that's it. New Orleans was quick to comply. The closure was financially devastating to musicians. Certainly, there were other places to play jazz in New Orleans, in cafes, dance halls, and hotels, but the loss of Storyville was still profoundly felt. Many unemployed African American musicians traveled to cities that were more welcoming, especially Chicago. Early jazz continued to evolve, and sometimes rapidly. Therefore, when jazz first burst into national prominence via recordings that were made in Chicago in the early 1920s, some of the original features had already been lost. So that's why it went to Chicago. All right. One of the effects of the move north was increased sophistication, and also Storyville was closed. The players were growing more expert on their instruments as audiences' expectations also increased. Musical literacy, so being able to read music, was improving, so more music was being arranged and notated before it was performed, reducing the amount of improvisation. Because the earliest instrumentalists weren't always very adept, that means skilled, solo breaks in which one person is showcased were brief and not too frequent. I'm going to go ahead and define some of those words. In Chicago, the solos grew longer, usually lasting for an entire chorus, and the amount of collective improvisation was much smaller. The musical changes from the south to the north mounted up and set the stage for the next jazz substyle, swing. The swing novators. For many Americans, the origination of jazz in Storyville was seen as a symptom of civilization's decline. They were like, what kind of music is this? This is horrible. A lot of people who are very traditional believe that jazz was society declining down. Isn't that hilarious, right? It's funny if you think back. It didn't help that livery stable blues seemed to parody music making by featuring all sorts of animal sounds. The clarinet mimicked a rooster, the trombone produced cow-like mooing, the cornet neighed like a horse. Many people therefore viewed jazz as merely a hilarious novelty. Racism also played a role, since jazz had been cultivated initially by African Americans. In the mid-1920s, however, a number of musicians began to experiment with a new jazz substyle, swing, that would in time break free from the stigma suffered by earlier types of jazz. Three individuals were the primary influences in the early development of swing: Fletcher Henderson, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie. Each man experimented with various aspects of what was to become big band jazz. They wrote music that alternated between arranged and improvised passages, emphasizing chords, not just single notes, and richer harmonies. They reduced syncopation, emphasizing the strong beats more, and making music more danceable. Many of these ideas could be found in keyboard swing music as well, but it was the band leaders who caught the public's attention the soonest. Do you guys remember what syncopation was? Fletcher Henderson. Posterity calls Fletcher Henderson. Posterity is like throughout history, all the people, the descendants that come after you, calls Fletcher Henderson the father of big band jazz because of his early work with swing. Henderson and his arranger Don Redman are credited with 4 primary innovations. First, Henderson started increasing the size of the band, so more people in the band. Second, Henderson and Redman began to employ sectional writing, also known as block voicing. This approach meant that instruments that belonged to the same family, such as all of the saxophones, played similar music. Third, those sections often participated in call-and-response patterns. And lastly, they wrote the first big band pieces to use the riff extensively. All of these traits are found in the Stampede. Let's listen to it now. And remember, a riff is when somebody just does like a solo and keeps going on and on with their instrument. Edward Kennedy, Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington is one of the best-known musicians of the 20th century, composing around 2,000 pieces of music. However, his band's arranger, Billy Strayhorn, wrote the number that became the Ellington Band's theme song in 1941 called "Take the A Train." Ellington was an especially beloved bandleader whose players often stayed with him for decades, and he ensured that they were among the highest-paid musicians in the business. One of Ellington's particular gifts as a leader was his ability to showcase the musicians effectively. He often expanded pieces beyond the 3-minute time limit dictated by audio technology of the day. Those longer works gave him the space to feature a string of successive solos from his outstanding players. In 1931, Ellington arranged the first big band piece with swing in its title, "It Don't Mean a Thing If I Ain't Got That Swing." You've heard of this before. Let's listen to it. Now let's talk about Count Basie. I don't know if it's Count William Bessie or Basie. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Both Henderson and Ellington were active largely in New York, whereas Count Basie, Count Basie, built his career in Kansas City, Missouri after getting stranded there in 1927. Interesting. He began developing his approach in Benny Moten's Kansas City Orchestra. So this is Duke Ellington right here. He began developing his approach in Benny Moten's Kansas City Orchestra and went on to lead his own band after Moten's death in 1935. By 1937, the Count Basie Orchestra had become one of the nation's leading bands. While listening to the exuberance of Moten's swing, which can be heard here, we might forget that 1932 was in the heart of the Depression and that people were going hungry. It is easy to understand how this lively style of jazz helped to keep up spirits. So this is an example of how music not just has a purpose in providing people with something to hear, but it also was important in society at that time because people were really truly suffering. A lot of people were just in despair. But lively music like jazz can really lift up the spirit of a country, of its people, and make them feel energized and hopeful for a better future. All right, that is it. We're going to do experimentalism for the next video. So that's it for today, and I'll see you guys all next Friday after school. And remember, we end at 4 p.m. Thanks, and goodbye.